Hey everybody, so Dungeonborne just released a patch that does a lot of class rebalancing. Now, I will be going over that first, so if you just want to see what's in that patch, because it's only posted on their Discord, so you probably don't see it anywhere else. So if you want to see what's in that Dungeonborne patch, just stick around, I'll go over that first. But later after that, I'm going over some other things. I just want to talk about that right now. I made a video on Dungeonborne versus Dark and Darker, and I kind of talked about why I prefer Dungeonborne and why I didn't like Dark and Darker. Since then, a lot of the things I said didn't turn out to be entirely true, and a lot of people seem to have made this into a very Dungeonborne versus Dark and Darker thing. The things I said that weren't entirely true were that Dungeonborne was a very melee-focused game. Now, it did seem like they wanted Dungeonborne to be a very melee-focused game, but since then, a lot of people have figured out how to abuse ranged classes to a degree in which the melee classes, or at the release of pure melee classes like the Death Knight and the Fighter, ended up in the lower half of character strength. Now, I do agree that Dungeonborne ended up being more ranged focus than originally intended, but in this patch, my hopes, I'm going to call it my faith in the developers has been rewarded, and they have done a lot of focus on ensuring that melee remains relevant and viable in this game. Dark and Darker, which I'll go over to at the end of this video, so just give me a couple minutes set up here and then we'll go over the patch notes. Dark and Darker, their patch notes tend to just be all over the place, weird, unfocused, do a lot of different things that don't really seem to ever improve the game or make it better, and I'm going to be going over that because a lot of people that enjoy Dark and Darker continue to leave me comments and hate mail and blah 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 about how Dark and Darker actually blah 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 blah, and I don't agree with those statements. But first, let's talk about balance in extraction games. I think that there's two kinds of characters you can play in an extraction looter kind of game. There are classes that are good at fighting, and there are classes that are good at extracting. There are also classes that are good at extracting and fighting. Those I would just generally call very overpowered. So for example, Rogue, although difficult to just straight up win a 1v1 brawl as a Rogue, is very good at hit and run, harass, extracting, just generally staying alive, getting loot out. They're just very generally good at that sort of thing. So Rogue, despite a lot of people calling them underpowered, is by far the most popular class, making up 1/5 of all classes, and has an enormous extraction rate. So despite a lot of people calling Rogue underpowered because they struggled to win the 1v1 melee brawls, actually ends up being one of the most powerful classes in the game right now. Now, I don't believe a class should be nerfed for just being able to escape well and extract, and I don't believe a class should be buffed because they can't escape well, because, you know, being able to escape well, let's say I'm playing Fighter, right? Fighter's pretty good at fighting, or at the very least they should be good at fighting. They're not right now, but they did just get patched. Fighter should be good at fighting, but not so great at extracting. That's kind of the balance, right? Some classes are good at killing other classes. Some classes are good at getting the loot and getting out of the dungeon. That's just generally how these games are going to go. So when we look at these extraction rates, I don't believe they posted this, the developers of Dungeonborne did post this. I don't believe that 100% that if a class has a low extraction rate like Cryomancer, I don't believe they should just immediately get buffed. I don't believe Cryomancer is so much underpowered as it is kind of harder to play, because they need good positioning, they're easier to kill, but a supported Pyromancer can do a lot of damage. Now, maybe Pyromancer is a little bit underpowered, I don't know, but at any rate, it does seem to me that the developers aren't knee-jerking and just dramatically buffing Pyromancer just because Pyromancer is bad at extracting. So what actually are the patch notes? Okay, let's go through them right now. Well, actually, instead of doing that, let me, I'm going to go over this stuff right now. So Druid has a very high pick rate. I should say not very high. It is a high pick rate and absolutely ludicrous extraction rate. Rogue has an absolutely ludicrous pick rate and a very high extraction rate. Swordmaster has a high pick rate and good extraction rate. Cryomancer has a high pick rate, decent extraction rate. Death Knight and Cryomancer are about neck and neck for pick rate and extraction rate, and despite that, in my opinion and in a lot of other people's opinions, Cryomancer is blatantly stronger than Death Knight, and in fact is actually quite overpowered. And the developers don't, despite posting this list, this is not what they're balancing the game on. Priest is played by absolutely nobody, and in my opinion is probably the weakest class in the game. Despite having an extraction rate higher than the other two classes below them, I believe a lot of that is due to the fact that they have such a low pick rate that only good players play Priest. No one kind of plays a class as a tourist, let's call it that way. And I don't believe Priest is good at all. Just as my personal opinion, before I even read the patch notes, I know they didn't because I already read them, but I think what Priest needs, I think all their abilities need to do a little bit of damage. So for example, when you shield yourself, it should do a slight AoE damage to people around you. When you heal a teammate, it should do a slight AoE damage to people around them. Priest is laughably undertuned right now, and despite being a class that allows you to never really die to the PvE, has a very low extraction rate because they can't escape melee. They aren't the best in fights. I don't believe they're like unplayable, but they're definitely, in my opinion, probably the weakest class in the game right now. So let's go look at the patch notes. And then, by the way, there's Fighter and Pyromancer. Pyromancer is horrible at extracting because anyone gets in melee, they die. Fighter is just not really good at all right now. Despite being popular, Fighter is pretty bad right now, which is a bit of a disappointment because they're a cool class. But we'll see here. They did do some good stuff for our Fighter pals. So let's look at what they did in this patch. Server maintenance, blah, 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 blah. Okay, class balance. Dev comments. I made my text bigger, so I hope you guys can read it. We highly value feedback regarding class performance and continuously monitor the community's impact. Combined with our data analysis, we aim to ensure each class has its unique strengths and identify while maintaining overall class balance. Okay, Druid. The Druid is getting the most significant changes in this update, which will break into 3 parts. So Druid has currently, well, they had an aura that allowed them to see everybody around them. Any enemy within 30 meters of them, they could just automatically detect and see through walls. This has obviously led to a few balance issues and has obviously led to a few people calling the class really, really overpowered on that alone. Passive sense predatory senses. This audacious and somewhat wildly designed passive made druids exceptionally effective at gathering information. To balance their high presence in high-end matches, we're reducing the clarity and speed of the information they can gather, giving opponents a better chance to counter them. The vision effective predatory sense will now display for 3 seconds every 5 seconds instead of being permanent. The perception radius is reduced to 30 meters. From 30 meters to 25 meters. The detection red dots from predatory sense will no longer appear on the minimap. So there's 3 nerfs going out here. The way it words it is a bit iffy. I have not personally played Druid to test this myself, but there's 2 ways I could take this. Either you can see enemies for 3 seconds out of every 5 seconds, meaning they're invisible for 2, or every 5 seconds it updates their information. So every 5 seconds you just get a ticket where they are, not an up-to-date list on every time they're about to round the corner and stuff like that. The radius is also being reduced a little bit, which helps. And then they no longer get to see enemies on their minimap, so sneaking up on a druid is no longer impossible. This is a really good nerf to the druid predatory senses. I kind of respect their what do you want to call it? Their boldness. I'm going to call it that. I kind of respect their boldness in keeping a pretty overpowered passive in a game like this. It makes Druid very unique and different from the other classes. We'll see if it's a good idea at all to keep this in the game. It's a bit debatable, I won't lie. This passive is obviously enormously powerful, so keeping it in the game is a bit of a questionable thing to do in the first place, but I can respect their boldness in trying to rebalance it. These are massive nerfs to it, so trying to rebalance it is kind of like, okay, like I see where they're going with it, right? So we'll see. We'll see if it's balanced at that. Mobility, so here's a second huge nerf. Druid's information gathering ability combined with their top tier mobility made them nearly impossible for melee classes to catch them, leading to a very high extraction rate. Base movement speed in human and panther forms is reduced by 20 points. This is actually an absolutely huge nerf. I don't think people really understand how massive a nerf this is. Transformation will no longer clear debuffs, such as the slow effects from Thunderclap Flask. So unlike Dark and Darker, by the way, for those who play Dark and Darker and Dungeonborne, I think classes do have base movement speed based on the class. At the very least, now they do. Because Druid now just gets negative 20 points of movement speed just for being a Druid. And transforming into Panther no longer clears slows. So if you hit a Druid with Thunderclap, they can't just get into Panther, pounce away, and be totally fine. The cooldown for Panther's form's E-skill Shadow Assault is increased from 5 seconds to 8 seconds. So they're 20 movements slower, and they don't cleanse slows, and the cooldown on their jump away has been nearly doubled. So that's actually rather insane. So between these nerfs, the class has definitely hit pretty hard. So in my opinion, if they just did these, the class would basically be unplayable. They would basically be murdered. So they are doing some buffs here to try to bring them back up. Now, will the buffs undo the nerfs? Will the class end up stronger? So With the above changes, druids will need to take on more risk when engaging. Therefore, we have increased the damage in Panther form, aiming to reward druids for making bold decisions. The damage of the Panther form's E-skill Shadow Assault has been increased by 50%. The damage of basic attacks in Panther form increased by 20%. So Panther will now deal more damage, and Shadow Assault will now deal more damage. Druid will now play more like an assassin, and it will play less like a hit and run permakite mage thing. So I do think these are overall good changes. This does mean that Druid could probably assassinate things like Cryomancer better. They could probably assassinate things like Pyromancer better. But the reduced movement speed by 20 is pretty substantial. No longer clearing slows, although it never should have cleared slows in the first place. Even World of Warcraft, I don't think allows Druids to clear slows, right? Or maybe they do eventually. I don't know. I haven't played the game in a decade and a half, right? So that's a big nerf, and that never should have been in the game in the first place. And their Shadow Assault should never have a 5-second cooldown and a giga jump away. So that never should have happened either. So these 3 nerfs are huge. This nerf is also huge. But in return, if the Druid gets on you, they will do more damage, which is probably overall, in my opinion, a good thing. So we've also been paying attention to melee classes. Currently, plate armor classes can deal a lot of damage up close, but lack flexibility and damage mitigation. We want them to be more resilient against agile opponents. So currently, right now, the problem with the plate classes, Fighter and Death Knight, is they pretty much lose automatically to Swordmaster, and they cannot catch Rogue either. So if you automatically lose to Swordmaster and you can't catch Rogue and you can't catch Druid and you can't catch Cryomancer and you can't catch Pyromancer, the question becomes, what do the plate classes even do in life? So Death Knight seems to be doing a bit better because his pull allows him in a team fight situation to grab an enemy of the opposing team, rip them out of their position, and kill them. Death Knight is a very interesting class because fundamentally, if you catch someone with a good pull and your team kills them, it's basically impossible to come back from that, right? In a 3v3 type situation, if one of your team members are dead for free, that ends it. That ends your team's dungeon run. At that point, the 2 remaining people have to just sprint out and try to extract from the dungeon. They're doomed, right? So Death Knight definitely seems to be doing better. Fighter, on the other hand, seems to be massively undertuned. On release, it did seem that Fighter was doing pretty good. Their Whirlwind was killing enemies. But as time went on, it became more and more clear that Fighter is just not very good at all. And in fact, seems a bit undertuned. So what are they doing for Fighter and what are they doing for Death Knight? Okay. Fighter is getting just 10% more base health, period. They're just getting 10% more base health. Then their charge skill is going from a 40-second cooldown to a 30-second cooldown. Then their inspire skill is going from a 40-second cooldown to a 30-second cooldown. And it will have more effective range, allowing it to buff up teammates better. So I guess the idea here is that Fighter will be better at trying to play 3s. Fighter and Trios was kind of questionable. They were being entirely replaced by Swordmaster and Death Knight. Death Knight was also kind of just being replaced by Swordmaster as well. It seems with no nerfs here on Swordmaster, it does seem like a lot of their idea is to buff up Fighter and Death Knight so the other, the pure melee classes can compete better against Swordmaster. We'll see if this is enough. These buffs on Fighters don't look good enough because Fighter has no damage mitigation and Plate, ironically, has the lowest damage mitigation of any of the armors in the game. So the thing is, Plate does multiply your health a lot. Fighter and Death Knight tend to have the biggest health pools in the game by far, but they tend to have the least damage mitigation, which is kind of odd, but whatever. So Fighter gets 10% more base health, which will be multiplied by their plate armor. We'll see if that's going to be enough survivability. I'm not really sure. It'll definitely improve their extraction rate because they'll survive one more hit. But the thing is, as you start drinking health potions and bandaging and doing stuff like that, having more damage mitigation tends to be better. I suspect one thing they're trying to avoid is giving Fighter too much damage mitigation, thereby enabling a default playstyle of like Fighter Cleric to be dominant. In a lot of these sorts of games, D&D sorts of games, the Fighter Priest tends to be a very dominant playstyle. So I think they're trying to keep Fighter and Death Knight to have lower damage mitigation so they're not, automatically paired with the Priest, and then the Priest needs to only be balanced with playing with the Fighter. I think they're trying to avoid that, but I think they're trying to avoid that a bit too hard here. Overall, is this going to make Fighter viable? In my opinion, probably not. I think they maybe should have increased their base dexterity by a little bit, maybe. Like maybe giving them like 4 more base dexterity just so they walk a little bit more. as is, fighter getting 10% more base health, like it's good. Getting a longer range and getting a lower cooldown on their Inspire and Charge, these are also good. Like these definitely help, and combined with the Druid nerfs and the Cryomancer nerfs coming up, this will definitely allow fighter to move from being maybe bottom tier to being mid tier. I think after these, the classes will be way more balanced with each other. I think after this, the two biggest issues will be Pyromancer can't get out of a dungeon, and Priest is just terrible at everything. I'm kind of shocked they still haven't nerfed Priest. Mithril Zealot is just the scavenger version of Fighter, so Mithril Zealot is also being buffed. This should help scavenger runs do a little bit better, mind you, because scavenger runs were kind of having a few issues because the classes that give scavengers are Priest, what is it? I think it's Priest, Rogue, and Fighter, and two of those classes were absolutely terrible. So this should help Scavenger perform a little bit better. Yeah. Death Knight. While Death Knight's Q skills are active, he now gets 15% damage mitigation. Now this is why I'm questioning the Fighter changes, because Fighter gets more base HP, but Death Knight gets damage mitigation. I guess the idea is that Fighter is just supposed to be Barbarian. My inner theory that Fighter is just Barbarian continues to be true. I think the developers didn't want to add Fighter and Barbarian, but then they were bored by Fighter, so they ended up just making Fighter into Barbarian. That's effectively what they are. A giant health pool, low damage mitigation, just very high damage and abilities that make them run quickly. That just seems like Barbarian, no? Even their two abilities, Whirlwind and Battle Cry, are just Barbarian abilities. So I think Fighter is just supposed to be Barbarian, which is odd, but okay. So Death Knight, while his Q skills are active, he now gets 15% damage mitigation. This should enable Death Knight to trade more fairly with Swordmaster. While Fighter did get buffs on cooldowns and base HP, and all Death Knight got was 15% damage mitigation with their Q active. It might seem like I'm being biased here, but do mind you that I play mostly Death Knight, and I think Death Knight is a good bit better than Fighter. So I do think with these changes, Death Knight will continue to be better. Now that's because damage mitigation is much better than more base HP. That affects things like health potions, bandages, that affects things like shields from allies or from potions or stuff like that. So I definitely think that this buff for Death Knight is better than the buff for Fighter. This should allow Death Knight to trade with Swordmaster better. This should allow them to maybe potentially tank through some Cryomancer stuff a little bit better. We'll see. Potential upcoming change. We're considering speeding up the casting animation for Death Knight's Soul Shroud and providing a stronger slow effect during its effect. So I think one of the problems is Death Knight has two abilities. He's got the pull, but then he's got two abilities he can swap between. One doesn't do enough damage and everyone ignores it. The other one has too long of a cooldown, or I shouldn't say cooldown. It is too long of a cast time and everyone walks away from you after you use it. So I do think reducing its cast animation and giving a stronger slow while you're casting it would be a good change. My only concern would be removing the counterplay from Death Knight. I don't think, because here's the problem. If you're playing Death Knight, you guys have probably seen videos of me playing Death Knight. The problem is, if you're playing Death Knight and you activate your Q and someone actually stands next to you, you basically automatically win the fight. And I don't think that that is good then. If its animation is faster and it slows people longer, so it's even harder for people to get out of it and stay out of it, I think that Death Knight could be seen as a bit oppressive and maybe a bit frustrating for people to deal with. So here we've got the big nerfs to Cryomancer. Now Cryomancer is probably the biggest reason why Death Knight and Fighter can't extract. So let's see what they do here. There's a bug where Cryomancer's stamina passive, Frost Echoes, and E-skill, Ice Armor, interaction caused higher than expected tankiness. We are fixing this issue in the patch and will continue to monitor the Cryomancer's performance. I don't know what that means, because they're not giving, like, they're not giving any notification on what that means, but apparently they had higher than expected tankiness. Okay. The stamina passive Frost Echoes is changed to when allies deal unblocked active damage to targets affected by the Q skill, they gain a 40-point shield. This shield no longer stacks. So one of the problems with Cryomancer is whenever they hit an enemy with their Q, be it the AoE slow or the single target dot, If an ally hit that target, the Cryomancer got a 50-point shield. That stacked indefinitely and made it so Cryomancer was all but impossible to deal with if you were trying to kill them as your first target, which led to some serious issues where if you have a dude running around debuffing your entire team and you can't really target him, it makes Cryomancer a bit overpowered. Additionally, the Cryomancer's E skill, Ice Armor, costs no energy or mana to use. So the Cryomancer would just spam that. Every 30 seconds, it would spam a new shield. Every single shield would slow the first enemy that hit them while giving them a giant shield. Between those two things, it meant that Cryomancer permanently kited every melee, never ran out of resources, and just automatically beat every melee. It was really unfun. It was probably the biggest reason that Fighter and Death Knight were not good. Are these two nerfs big enough? Between the two of them, it should be good. It should mean in a 1v1 type situation, if you actually get on Cryomancer, you can maybe stay on them, or in a long fight, they can actually run out of soul energy. Now, I don't know what this higher than expected tankiness means. Because they say this is a bug. I don't know what bug or anything they fixed, okay? So, potential upcoming change. We're considering modifying the slow effect of Thunderclap Flask to no longer provide a less effective shield. Wait, what? We are considering modifying the slow effect of Thunderclap Flask to last longer, but provide a less effective slow, ensuring it remains a useful tool for melee classes to chase their opponents, while limiting the synergy between Thunderclap Flask and Lightning Staff. So that would maybe be a good change. Right now, Thunderclap Flask is a 75% slow for 4 seconds. That means most staff users are throwing Thunderclap Flasks on you, then hitting you with a Lightning Staff. This is very, very, very effective. All melee classes can do in return is throw their they can throw their Thunderclap back on the staff user and then try to run them down. If the slow lasts longer but has a less effective slow, so let's say, so instead of a 75% slow for 4 seconds, let's say it was a 50% slow for 6 seconds, which would probably be more balanced. That would also mean that Cryomancer couldn't Thunderclap, then slow you with their shield, then slow you with their Q, because depending on how slow stack in this game, that wouldn't be effective as much as having a 75% slow for 4 seconds so they can just completely kite out. So this should, if they do this change, I think this would be a good change. I think Thunderclap is a bit overpowered as is, but I think changing it to prefer melee classes would be a really good change. I think that especially what they're talking about here is a very good change. So I actually think the developers have a good head on their shoulders. They haven't done, I always meme this in any of my other videos. If you guys watch me, I always meme this. The whole like developers don't know how to do basic math. None of these changes have failed the basic math challenge. The only one I'm really questionable on is increasing the fighter's base HP. But the thing is, if you replace fighter with barbarian, it makes sense. I think, in my heart, I think they just want fighter to be barbarian. I think Death Knight is a fighter, and he just happens to have a pull, and I think fighter is just barbarian. And when you look at it like that, it kind of makes sense. They're also adding a low quality crossbow and 15 bolts whenever you die. So, those classes that can use crossbow bolts, like Fighter, Death Knight, and Swordmaster, I think, they should have a ranged option when they start the game, which should help people play a little bit better. And then they're just talking about the class things here. So I actually think this is a really good patch, and I think this hits a lot of issues. It doesn't add any more content or anything like that, but so far as balance in the classes, I think this is a really good change for the game. I think that's a really good change for the game. So let me then talk about Dark and Darker. Now, why am I going to be talking about Dark and Darker? Because a lot of people did not like how I talk crap about Dark and Darker, and how I talk crap about how their patches are really weird, random, and don't really make any sense. So let's talk about Dark and Darker and their patches. This is when I stopped playing the game. Now, here's the issue with what happened in Dark and Darker. They decided, for some reason, on this patch, that most items in the game that have no armor penetration should randomly now get armor penetration. Now, of course, the meta in trios was to wear armor, but the meta in solos and duos was to wear as little armor as possible. So they doubled down on the really cancerous solos and duo meta while enhancing I guess that's about it. They just doubled down on the solos duo meta of having no armor. Additionally, they gave a shitload of armor penetration to ranged weapons. Now, whereas here's the thing, I do agree that Rangers were really bad in trios to the point of basically being unplayable, but by giving Rangers more armor penetration on their weapons, they just doubled down even harder on making it really, 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 really dumb and hard to play with armor in solos and duos, which just made it even worse trying to play melee classes. Now, because they made this change, and because for some random reason they decided to giga buff warlocks, they decided to nerf barbarians twice, then increase armor pen on weapons, and shockingly, this has caused fighters and barbarians to be absolutely terrible. So what did they do after this? And this is exactly what I talk about with the Dark and Darker developers. They do changes that they don't really think through. It just seems like they did a change at random. Balance is like a game of chess. If you make a move, there's going to be a move made back at you. If you nerf all armor by making things have more armor pen, and you double nerf barbarian, and you buff warlock, what do you think that's going to do? So, and this is the exact change right here. This is when I stopped playing the game because I just got really frustrated by it. But then you can see over the next couple of patches, all they start doing is they start mass buffing barbarian and mass buffing fighter. Because it just started really unbalancing the game really, 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 really hard. But we can see here, Barbarian's physical damage reduction penalty from Rage gets changed to be even less. So, Barbarian Rage gets nerfed into the ground. Then it starts to get a little bit buffed. Then they start doing all these weird, huge buffs on Wizards. Then they have to start mass nerfing warlocks. Then they have to start buffing fighters. Then in the very next big patch you can see here, once again, we're nerfing the armor pen on daggers, but now we're adding more magic pen to wizard items for some reason. So now we're just all over the place. We're just all over the place. And now because clerics have these blunt weapon mastery, now clerics are really overpowered. So now clerics start getting nerfed. So we nerf the blunt weapon mastery on cleric. So War Mole cleric gets nerfed really hard here. And then we nerf the magic pen on the will stat. Then, oh god, we nerf armor in the game again. So the game is already being played with very low armor in solos and duos. The game is being played armor only in trios. And now we're running into issues where we're nerfing magic pen across the board. So we're nerfing magic resist across the board. We're buffing magic pen. We're buffing armor pen. And now, shockingly, you might be shocked by this. We have to start mass nerfing warlocks. We have to start mass buffing barbarians. And we can see this happening in the next patch as well, even. Oh boy, where do we have to go here? So cleric has to get nerfed again. Because, shockingly, once we've nerfed fighters and once we've nerfed barbarians by nerfing all their armor and magic resist, shockingly, this has made cleric overpowered. So now we need to start mass nerfing cleric. And you can see it just feels like they're always playing catch up. They're doing these really dumb changes that are breaking the game's balance, and then they just have to start playing catch up. So now we're just mass nerfing warlock because we made a really dumb warlock change. And now we can see, oh, where is it? Right here. So then we have to buff barbarian again because we nerfed magic resist, because we nerfed magic resist again, because we nerfed armor, because we buffed armor pen. We double nerfed barbarian, so barbarian needs to continuously be buffed. Now fighter needs to be double buffed. And it gets even better because now they're buffing all the weapons that barbarians and fighters can use. Berdache, halberd, double axe, double battle axe, war maul, quarterstaff. All these items start getting buffed. But now we start giving Cobalt crafted items now give 3.5% armor penetration as a primary attribute. So now it's like, do you see what I mean here? It's like they're so desperate for Dark and Darker to be a funny game where you two-shot people. But why? I don't want to play a game where we are just funny two-shotting people. That's just not an enjoyable experience for me. That's not what I like to do, but that's seemingly what the developers want. So we have all these patches, all this work, all these things are happening to just constantly rebalance the game over and over and over again. We've made armor worse, we've made magic resistance worse, just so we can have funny two-shots. People figured out ways to get tanky, so they nerfed it into the ground. But then by nerfing it into the ground, then we have to work on fighter, and we have to work on barbarian, and we have to work on ranger, and we have to work on rogue, and we have to work on cleric, and we have to work on wizard, and we have to work on warlock. And they've just broken the game, and then they just slowly unbreak the game. I mean, how many nerfs on warlocks have you guys seen here? Here's 2 nerfs on warlocks. How many other nerfs on warlocks did we have to do because they just continuously broke magic resistant stuff? Let's go up here. How many nerfs on warlocks do we see here? So there's, oh boy, was it here? No, was it here? Yep. Okay, so you have 1 nerf, 2 nerf, 3 nerf, 4 nerf, 5 nerf, 6 nerf, 7 nerf, 8 nerf, 9 nerfs on warlocks in one patch because they broke the game. How do you break the game that hard? That's just, okay, for those of you who play Dark and Darker, and those of you who come to my videos and you tell me, oh man, the meta in Dark and Darker is much better than Dungeonborne. I don't know why you don't enjoy the game. But what meta? If I played 2 months ago, trios would be really tanky people running around in a death ball having actual melee skirmishes. If I played the meta now, it would probably be, well, sorry, if I played the game a month ago, it would have been on a cleric and warlock running around dominating. If I played it now, well, I don't know who's dominant now. It could be rogues. I don't even know. So when you say the meta is good, or the meta is more melee focused, or the meta is this, or the meta is that, the meta in this game constantly changes around over and over and over again on like a month-to-month basis. Now, look, I'm totally fine with patches balancing the game. I'm totally fine with patches fixing some issues. But the problem I have is when a game like Dark and Darker is very unforgiving and requires you to farm for like 10 hours to get an actual good set of gear. It sucks to wake up after farming for 10 hours to get a good sense of, you know, a good set of gear. And then all of a sudden, all my shit is nerfed. And now my class is dead for a month until they rebalance the game again. You know what I mean? It's fun. It's good when they decide to buff the axes, because the axes and the war maul were terrible after they rebalanced the game. That's good, right? And even if they do nerf a class, I'd rather they nerf a class down like how they nerfed Cryomancer in a way that feels reasonable and fair, rather than just doing, oh no, we giga buffed Warlock, now we need to giga nerf Warlock, now we need to nerf Warlock again, oh no, now we need to make magic resist. Like, it's just so many balances going on. It's an actual problem. Okay, so I'm sorry, Dark and Darker people, but when you guys come into my comments and you tell me, oh, actually the meta is super good right now, how long will that last? And I don't know, dude. That game, I'm not trying to turn this into some Dark and Darker versus Dungeonborne issue. If you want to enjoy Dark and Darker, that's fine. Go enjoy Dark and Darker. Don't let me stop you from enjoying Dark and Darker. If you enjoy the game, just go play it, okay? That's fine. I'm not trying to tell you to not enjoy Dark and Darker, okay? But what I am saying is that me personally, and this is kind of me finishing my thoughts from the last video, I just didn't enjoy the way they did balance. I don't enjoy the way they try to enforce a low armor meta. I don't enjoy the way they try to enforce a 2-shot meta. I don't enjoy that. That's just not for me. I just don't want a meta where even if after I farm for 10 hours, I can be killed in 2 hits. And that very much seems to be where they want the game to be balanced. They nerf all survivability, they buff all damage, and it's not what I want out of the game. So that's all I have to say. So that's the Dungeonborne patch. That's why I just don't enjoy Dark and Darker. So hopefully, and I know it won't, but hopefully this satiates the Dark and Darker people who keep coming into my comments and saying, well, actually, you are just bad at the game. You don't know what to do. I know you guys are going to continue to do that, but surely by me showing you how schizo these patch notes are, hopefully you guys understand. Like, look at all the nerfs I had to do to Cleric. Like, how many nerfs on Cleric are we looking at here? 1 cleric nerf, 2 cleric nerf, 3 cleric nerf, 4 cleric nerf, 5 cleric nerf, 6 cleric nerf, 7 cleric nerf, 8 cleric nerf. That's just too many cleric nerfs, man. in one patch because you changed everything else in the game, so now cleric needs to be nerfed. Like, that's too many nerfs, man. It starts feeling really jank, and like they don't really know what they're doing. If they need to constantly be rebalancing the game that much, that often, that hard, it's clear to me that they don't really know what they're doing. Now, I am all for balancing. I'm all for adding new content, new classes, new weapons. I'm all for that. And I do understand that when you add new stuff, it might be underpowered, it might be overpowered. But when you're really not making that many changes to the game, and the game is statically the same game it's been for the last month or two, you shouldn't be having to do sweeping buffs and nerfs because you keep breaking the game. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully this was at least entertaining to listen to. But here you go, everybody. Thank you all. Thank you. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.